In February 2021, in Peterborough, Ontario, a Canadian audio company was sold, and its production line began to move north. The company was Bryston, which had built amplifiers in that city for more than 40 years. The destination was nearly 2 hours away, a dark brown building set back behind the trees on Highway 60, in the village of Dwight. That building belonged to a loudspeaker company called Axiom Audio. And Axiom had spent the previous 2 decades doing something the hi-fi trade considered unthinkable: selling speakers without a single dealer. No showroom, no demonstration room, no salesperson to move a pair of speakers into position and let a customer sit down and listen. For Peterborough, it meant assembly work leaving town. For Bryston's dealers, it meant a familiar brand now built inside a factory that had walked away from dealers entirely. A decade earlier, that arrangement would have sounded backwards. But the real story of Axiom Audio is not only the story of a factory in a village. It is the story of what happened to the room where Canadians used to listen before they bought. If you're new here, this channel documents the Canadian audio companies that shaped how this country listened. The speaker labs, the amplifier benches, the showrooms, and the factories. Subscribe, and the next one will find you. The story begins in a borrowed garage, in a decade when a Canadian speaker still had to be carried into a shop before anyone would believe it. In 1979, in a friend's garage north of Toronto, a young engineering graduate named Ian Colquhoun built his first pair of loudspeakers. A loudspeaker is a device that turns an electrical signal into sound moving through air. And in 1979, the trade around that device was crowded. Canadian living rooms were full of stereo systems. Stereo shops lined the commercial strips of Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, and Calgary. Console units still sat in basements. Every year, more brands arrived from Japan, from the United States, from Britain, and every one of them told the buyer the same thing: it sounded better. That was the problem Colquhoun walked into. Not a shortage of speakers, a shortage of proof. By 1980, he had formalized the operation as Colquhoun Audio Laboratories Limited, with a single brand, Axiom Audio. Company histories describe it this way: a garage project turned into a small manufacturing business inside a year. The first line, the AX Series 1, followed shortly after. It was a modest catalog, sold the way every Canadian speaker was sold at the time, to dealers who put it on a wall of other speakers and let customers listen. That wall is worth pausing on, because it defined the entire industry. A Canadian buyer in 1980 walked into a shop, sat on a bench, and listened to 4 or 5 pairs of speakers switched back and forth through a comparison panel. The buyer heard price tags. The buyer heard brand names. The buyer heard cabinet size and veneer quality, and whatever the salesperson had a reason to move that month. What the buyer could not hear was whether any of it was true. Then, around 1981, something happened that would separate Axiom from most of its competition for the next 40 years. Colquhoun was introduced to Dr. Floyd Toole, a Canadian physicist working at the National Research Council in Ottawa. The NRC, Canada's federal research organization, had an acoustical laboratory, and Toole was using it for something the loudspeaker industry had never systematically done. He was trying to determine whether speaker measurements could actually predict what listeners preferred. To do it, he needed 2 things. The first was an anechoic chamber, a test room lined with absorbent wedges so that reflections from walls, floor, and ceiling are eliminated. And a speaker can be measured on its own, without the room adding anything. Inside that chamber, engineers could plot frequency response, how evenly a speaker reproduces low, middle, and high sounds across the audible range. A flat, even response meant the speaker was adding little of its own character. A ragged one meant it was coloring everything it played. The second thing Toole needed was harder to build. He needed listeners who could not see what they were hearing. That was the double-blind listening test. Panels of listeners with normal hearing sat in a controlled room and rated loudspeakers they could not identify. No visible cabinets, no brand badges, no prices. Tool invited a handful of young Canadian speaker designers to take part in the work. Colquhoun was one of them. The results were uncomfortable for the industry. When listeners could see the speakers, their scores tracked price, size, and brand reputation. When they could not see them, those factors largely fell away, and the ratings began to line up consistently with what the anechoic chamber had already measured. Different listeners, different sessions, same pattern. For a designer standing in that room, the implication was immediate and permanent. Sound quality was not a matter of taste that vanished into argument. It was measurable. It could be engineered toward, tested against, and proven. By Colquhoun's own account, he spent roughly 11 years involved with the NRC work. It reset how Axiom designed everything that followed. But proof, it turned out, was expensive to act on. The measurements coming out of Ottawa did not simply confirm what designers already believed. They contradicted a great deal of it. A speaker that flattered a demonstration room could measure poorly. A speaker that measured well could sound unremarkable in a shop, because a shop is a hostile room. Hard surfaces, background noise, and a comparison panel that lets a customer hear 4 speakers in 90 seconds and remember none of them. Axiom redesigned toward the measurements anyway. In 1985, the company introduced the AX Series 2, a line built on what the NRC work had established: even frequency response, controlled behavior off to the sides of the speaker, and cabinets designed to interfere as little as possible with the drivers mounted in them. A driver is the moving part of a speaker that physically pushes air. A cabinet is the box that holds those drivers and shapes how they load into a room. In a Canadian basement rec room, a finished basement with a low ceiling, a concrete floor under carpet, and a couch pushed against a wall. The cabinet mattered as much as anything inside it. Get it wrong, and the bass arrived as a boom that made the drywall buzz. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the approach earned recognition. Available reports indicate Axiom products drew awards from audio and video press and from the Consumer Electronics Show, the industry's annual trade gathering where a small Canadian company could stand alongside brands 100 times its size. By then, the company was no longer near Toronto. In 1983, Colquhoun moved the operation roughly 150 miles north to Dwight, Ontario, the village where he had grown up near the northern edge of the Muskoka region. Muskoka is cottage country, lakes, granite, pine, and summer traffic heading up Highway 60 from the city every Friday afternoon. The logic was practical. Land was cheaper, space was available, skilled woodworking labor was, and a loudspeaker company is, more than anything else, a furniture company with an electrical department. Cabinet stock, veneer, saws, sanding, finishing. The physical work of building a speaker is carpentry, and Muskoka had carpenters. The cost was equally practical, and it would shape everything that came afterward. Dwight was roughly 2.5 hours from Toronto. It was farther still from Montreal, and a continent away from the American market where the volume was. Every finished speaker had to be crated and trucked south. Every dealer who might sell one was somewhere else. Every customer who wanted to hear one had to be standing in a room the company did not own, in front of a salesperson the company did not employ, beside 4 competing speakers the company had no control over. Axiom had solved the technical problem. It had measured its way to a defensible design philosophy while much of the industry was still arguing about taste. But the design philosophy lived in Dwight, and the decision lived in a shop 300 kilometers away. Ottawa had given the company a language for sound. It had not given the company a place to be heard. The chamber came first. At some point after the move north, Axiom stopped borrowing Ottawa's laboratory and began building its own. The centerpiece was an anechoic chamber constructed at the Dwight factory. In many respects a replica of the acoustical facility at the National Research Council, the same kind of room where the company's founder had spent his formative years as a designer. For a small manufacturer in cottage country, this was an unusual thing to own. Anechoic chambers are expensive, heavy, and useful for exactly one purpose. Most speaker companies of Axiom's size did not build them. They booked time in someone else's, a few days a year, and designed around whatever the visit revealed. Then came the tower. An anechoic chamber has a limit. Below roughly 80 hertz, the region of low bass, the bottom of a kick drum, the weight under an orchestra. The absorbent wedges stop working properly because the sound waves become longer than the room can absorb. So Axiom built a base measurement tower 100 feet tall, which allowed low-frequency measurements down to 10 hertz with no reflections at all. Anechoic conditions without a chamber. The tower's readings were then used to calibrate the chamber below 80 hertz. 10 hertz is below hearing. It is the frequency a listener feels rather than hears. The pressure in a chest during a movie explosion. The lowest pedal note of a pipe organ in a Canadian church on a January morning. Axiom had built the means to measure it in a village of a few hundred off a 2-lane highway. The rest of the facility followed. A power handling room, informally described as a torture chamber where drivers were driven until they failed. So the company knew where the limit was rather than guessing. Double-blind listening facilities, so the Ottawa methodology could be run in-house. A full electronics lab. Most speaker companies rented their evidence. Axiom manufactured it. The products that came out of that facility became the company's signature. The M-Series, bookshelf models such as the M22, floor-standing models such as the M60, were designed, measured, and refined inside the chamber before anyone was invited to listen. The design philosophy was blunt: build for an even, uncolored response, verify it in the chamber, confirm it in a blind test, and let the result be whatever the result was. By 1991, the factory was doing something else as well. Alongside its own catalog, Axiom had begun manufacturing loudspeakers for other brands. Original equipment work, where one company builds the product and another puts its name on it. That business mattered less for its revenue than for what it proved. The wood shop, the assembly benches, and the finishing line in Dwight could build to somebody else's specification, at somebody else's quality standard, on somebody else's schedule. The factory could build almost anything. What the factory could not build was the room where Canadians heard it. And that room had a price. When a speaker is sold through a specialty dealer, the retail price carries the cost of the entire chain. The distributor, the shop's floor space, the inventory sitting unsold, the staff, the demonstration room itself. The buyer pays for all of it. What arrives in the living room is a fraction of the sticker. Around the turn of the 2000s, shortly after marking 20 years in business, Axiom cut the chain. The company dismantled its dealer-based distribution and moved to selling directly to customers over the internet. Records suggest the shift came at a moment when online retail was still in its infancy, when a Canadian household connected through a telephone line, when a credit card number typed into a web page still felt like a gamble, and when almost nobody bought a 100-pound pair of hardwood cabinets sight unseen. Inside the hi-fi trade, the objection was immediate and obvious. Speakers were not a commodity. Speakers had to be heard. Axiom's answer was to move the audition rather than eliminate it. In place of a dealer's demonstration room, the company offered a trial period in the customer's own home, 30 days with the right to return. The speakers arrived by freight, went into the room they were actually going to live in, and played the music the buyer actually owned. It was a genuine argument and a technically defensible one. A demonstration room is not a living room. It is larger, harder, differently furnished, and tuned by whoever built it. A speaker that impresses in a shop is being judged in a space no customer will ever own. The company did not lower its price by building cheaper. It lowered its price by removing a room. But removing that room removed everything that came with it. No shelf, no salesperson to explain why one cabinet cost more than another, no wall of competitors to be measured against, and no chance encounter with a customer who had wandered in to buy a receiver. From the turn of the 2000s onward, everything rested on measurement, on published reviews, on word of mouth, and on a stranger being willing to open a crate in a room 3 provinces away. For a few years, that room was the only thing Axiom had removed. Then the market began removing it everywhere else. The crates began moving. They left Dwight the way everything leaves Dwight. By truck, down Highway 60, past the lakes and the closed summer cottages, south toward the freight terminals. Inside them were floor-standing cabinets and bookshelf pairs bound for addresses the company had never visited. Subdivisions outside Calgary, apartments in Montreal, farmhouses in Saskatchewan, and increasingly, addresses well outside Canada altogether. The company described itself in those years as serving a worldwide customer base from a factory in Muskoka, and the description was literal. There was no distributor in between. There was a website, a woodshop, and a loading door. What replaced the salesperson was a telephone. A buyer considering a pair of M22s did not walk into a shop and get handed an opinion. They phoned the factory, described the room, its dimensions, its ceiling, whether the couch sat against the back wall, whether the floor was carpet or hardwood, and got a recommendation from someone who had measured the product they were recommending. Then, the speakers arrived at the door, and a 30-day clock started. That clock did the work the demonstration room used to do. A customer in Winnipeg could take a week deciding in February. With the furnace running and the windows shut, playing the same records they had listened to for 20 years. Nobody was waiting for an answer. Nobody was standing beside them. Some sent the speakers back. The company had built the return into the model because the alternative was asking strangers to spend hundreds of dollars on a guess, and the factory could offer something no dealer inventory ever could. Because cabinets were built in-house rather than ordered by the container, finish was not fixed by what happened to be on a shelf. Axiom's catalog expanded into a range of veneers and painted finishes made to order in the Dwight woodshop. A buyer matching speakers to a cherry floor or to a black media unit or to a cottage room paneled in pine could specify the pair rather than settle for one of 3 options a distributor had committed to a year earlier. A dealer model could not do that. A dealer model required the speaker to already exist, in a box, in a warehouse, in a color someone had guessed at. The trade-off was patience. Made to order meant waiting, and waiting is not what a showroom sells. What held the whole structure together was evidence. With no shelf presence and no salesperson, the company had to make its case in public. Frequency response data went onto the website. Reviews in Canadian and American audio publications functioned as the demonstration room had once functioned. A third party, listening, and reporting. Awards accumulated. And in time, the specialty press began making the drive north themselves, touring the chamber, the tower, and the woodshop, and describing to readers what a Canadian loudspeaker factory in cottage country actually looked like. The tours mattered more than any single review. A photograph of an anechoic chamber in Dwight settled a question that no amount of advertising could. The company was not a marketing operation buying cabinets from overseas and adding a badge. It was a factory in Ontario, with a laboratory attached. By the middle of the 2000s, the arrangement had produced something genuinely unusual in Canadian audio. A manufacturer with no dealers, no showrooms, and no distributors, shipping speakers around the world from a village most Canadians drove past on their way to a lake, and a company built to prove things was not going to stop at speakers. In 2007, the loading door in Dwight began shipping amplifiers. An amplifier takes the small electrical signal from a source, a CD player, a turntable, later a streaming box, and raises it to the level required to move a speaker's drivers. For 27 years, Axiom had built only the loudspeaker half of that relationship, and had spent those years measuring what happened when a speaker met an amplifier somebody else designed. The A1400 series was the company's answer to the other half. Electronics, developed in the same building. tested in the same lab, matched to the loads its own cabinets actually presented. It was a logical extension, and it did not last as a line. The A1400 was eventually discontinued, but it established that the factory was no longer only a wood shop with a chamber attached. By 2012, the ambition had grown considerably. That year, Axiom introduced the LFR 1100, a floor-standing loudspeaker built around an idea the Ottawa research had pointed toward decades earlier, that what reaches a listener in a real room is never only the sound traveling straight from the speaker. It is that direct sound, plus everything bouncing off the walls, the ceiling, and the floor a few milliseconds later. The LFR 1100 radiated deliberately forward and rearward, treating the room's reflections as part of the design rather than as interference to be suppressed. Alongside it came the ADA series of amplifiers, digitally controlled, multi-channel, built for the home theater systems that had become the center of the Canadian living room. That living room had changed since 1980. A basement rec room in Ontario in 2012 was likely to hold a flat-panel television, a receiver, a subwoofer, and 5 or 7 speakers positioned around a sectional couch. The 2-channel stereo that Axiom had been founded to serve was no longer the default. Home theater was. Axiom's catalog tracked the shift completely. Bookshelf models, floor standers, center channels, quad-polar surround speakers designed to spread sound rather than aim it, and EP-series subwoofers to carry the bottom end. A household could buy an entire system from one factory, in one finish, measured against one set of standards, and have the whole thing arrive on a truck. And here is what makes this period worth understanding properly, because it is easy to get backwards. Axiom's direct model was not thriving because the traditional Canadian audio trade was collapsing. It was thriving alongside it. Through the 2000s, the dealer system was still functioning. Specialty shops still ran demonstration rooms in Toronto, Vancouver, Ottawa, and Halifax. Big box chains still devoted floor space to speakers a customer could actually hear before buying. Canada still contained real loudspeaker manufacturing. Toronto, in particular, remained a genuine center of speaker production, with factories building hundreds of models under multiple brands and shipping them worldwide. A Canadian buyer in 2008 could go either way: drive to a shop, sit on a bench, listen to 4 pairs, and take one home that afternoon. Or read a set of measurements, phone a factory in Muskoka, and wait for a crate. Both routes were live. Both routes were normal. 2 entirely different theories about how a loudspeaker should reach a human being were operating in the same market at the same time. And both of them were working. That was the peak, not a sales figure, but a condition. A country with enough audio culture to sustain both the room and the alternative to the room. For a decade, a Canadian listener could still choose: drive to a dealer room and hear a speaker, or trust a measurement and open a carton at home. One of those 2 choices was about to disappear. And it was not the carton. The model worked, then everyone else discovered it. The advantage did not fail. It dissolved. Around the turn of the 2000s, selling a loudspeaker directly to a customer over the internet was a genuine competitive position. It required a factory willing to abandon a distribution system, a laboratory capable of producing evidence in place of a demonstration, and a return policy underwriting the whole gamble. Very few companies had all 3. Within a decade, none of that was rare. Every brand had a website. Every brand published specifications. Every brand offered a return window because every retailer did. The thing Axiom had built its business around, reaching the customer without a middle layer, became the ordinary condition of the market. A company can survive that. What it cannot do is charge for it. Then the ground underneath the entire Canadian speaker industry shifted. On the 15th of August 2006, Klipsch Group, an American loudspeaker manufacturer, announced the acquisition of Audio Products International. API was a Toronto company, founded in 1973, and it was not a boutique. It built more than 200 loudspeaker models under the Energy, Mirage, and Athena names, and exported to more than 50 countries. In terms of sheer manufacturing volume, it was among the largest speaker operations in the country. The brands did not vanish that year. Available reports indicate the lines were gradually narrowed and reorganized under their new ownership over the following years, with production and support restructured well away from where they had started. What did change quickly was Toronto. The city had been a real center of loudspeaker manufacturing. Cabinets, drivers, engineering, service departments, and the trained people who staffed all of it. That concentration thinned. For a factory in Dwight, this was not distant news. A Canadian speaker manufacturer does not operate alone. It draws on suppliers, machinists, veneer houses, freight arrangements, and a labor pool that knows what a crossover is. When the largest domestic operation contracts, the specialist supply chain around it contracts too, and every remaining Canadian manufacturer buys further from home, in smaller quantities, at worse prices. Axiom's response was the one available to a company that had built its own chamber: make more of it in-house. Available accounts describe a facility fabricating not only cabinets but plastic components on its own equipment, which is unusual for a company of that size, and which is what self-reliance looks like when the alternative is disappearing. Meanwhile, the room itself was closing. Through the 2000s, the Canadian retail floor consolidated. Specialty hi-fi shops that had survived on demonstration rooms and expertise faced big box chains selling on price and volume, and many did not survive it. Then the chains faced the same pressure from online retail, and in 2015 Best Buy retired the Future Shop banner entirely, closing part of the chain and converting the rest, which removed a large block of Canadian floor space where a household could hear a speaker before buying one. Every closure eliminated a demonstration room. This should have been a triumph for a company that had walked away from demonstration rooms in the first place. In practice, it eliminated something Axiom depended on more than it may have appeared. The direct model had never competed against dealers. It had competed against the idea of dealers. The shop was the reference point that made a factory direct price look like a discovery. Once the shop was gone, the comparison was no longer between Muskoka and a showroom in Toronto. It was between Muskoka and every loudspeaker on Earth, listed on one screen, sorted by price. And on that screen, the argument that had carried Axiom for 25 years was very hard to see. Frequency response data is powerful evidence in a laboratory and a weak sales tool in a product grid. A buyer scrolling through options at 11 at night sees a photograph, a star rating, a number of reviews, and a price. A chamber in Dwight, a 100-foot tower calibrated to 10 Hz, 11 years of federal research methodology. None of it renders in that layout. What renders is whether the shipping is free. Then the listening changed shape. By the mid-2010s, the flat-panel television that anchored the Canadian living room had become too thin to hold decent speakers, and the solution the market chose was the soundbar. A single horizontal enclosure placed under the screen, often with a wireless subwoofer, replacing the 5 or 7 separate speakers a home theater system required. It was easier. It was cheaper. It needed no receiver, no speaker wire stapled along a baseboard, and no argument about where the surround speakers should go. For a factory that built cabinets one at a time in a wood shop, this was the most serious shift of all. The soundbar did not merely compete with Axiom's products, it removed the occasion for them. A household that would once have bought a 7-piece system over 3 or 4 years, floor standers first, center channel next, surrounds and a subwoofer later, now made a single purchase and considered the matter settled. The catalog that had grown through the 2000s was built for a customer who was steadily becoming rarer. None of these were failures of the company. Axiom kept measuring. Axiom kept building in Dwight. Axiom kept sending speakers out the loading door on a 30-day promise. But the room the company had walked out of in 2000 was not being replaced by a better room. It was being replaced by no room at all. Then there was the arithmetic of building furniture in Ontario. A loudspeaker is heavy, awkward, and fragile in exactly the wrong combination. A pair of floor-standing cabinets is 100 pounds of wood that must arrive without a single dented corner, which means double-walled cartons, foam, corner blocks, and a freight company that will not stack a pallet badly. From Dwight, every one of those cartons traveled south before it traveled anywhere else. That cost had always existed. What changed was what it was being compared against. Through the 2000s and 2010s, an increasing share of the loudspeakers sold in Canada arrived by container, built in volume in Asia, in cabinets produced by the thousand to a single specification. A wood shop that offered made-to-order veneers, the very flexibility that had once been a selling point, was, in cost terms, the slowest possible way to build a box. Hardwood veneer, individual finishing, small production runs, and Canadian labor do not compete with a container on price. They can only compete on what the finished product does, and on whether the buyer can be persuaded to care. Persuading the buyer to care had become the hard part. By the mid-2010s, the sound in most Canadian homes was no longer coming from cabinets at all. It came from a bar under a television, a wireless speaker on a kitchen counter, a phone on a bedside table, and, more than anything, from headphones. The compact disc gave way to streaming, which put every recording ever made behind one subscription and moved the act of listening onto a device the listener carried. A generation formed its taste on earbuds, on transit, in a jacket pocket. None of that is a judgment. It is a room count. The dedicated listening space. A couch, 2 speakers, 100 records, and an afternoon stopped being a normal feature of a Canadian household and became a hobby with a name. And a hobby has a demographic. Which brings the story to the problem that quietly reshaped Canadian audio in a way no retail chain or import container ever did. The people who had built these companies were getting old. Canada's specialty audio industry had been founded, almost without exception, by engineers who started in the 1960s and 1970s, in garages, in rented industrial units, on the strength of a single design. 40 years later, those founders still owned the companies, still designed the products, and in many cases still ran the benches. What almost none of them had was a plan for what came next. In 2020, that question arrived at Bryston. Bryston, in Peterborough, Ontario, had been building amplifiers since the 1970s. The kind of equipment that ended up in recording studios and broadcast facilities as often as in living rooms, with a service reputation that treated a 20-year-old amplifier as a repairable object rather than an obsolete one. That year, company president Brian Russell died unexpectedly. His brother Chris, then chief executive, concluded that the family firm needed a succession plan rather than an heir. The buyer was Ian Colquhoun. The announcement came in early 2021. James Tanner, who had handled Bryston's sales and marketing since the 1970s, partnered in the purchase and became chief executive, while ownership sat with Colquhoun Audio Laboratories, the parent company of Axiom Audio. And here the arrangement produced its central irony. Bryston's distribution did not change. The brand stayed in specialty shops, with its dealers, sold the way it had always been sold. The company that had walked out of the dealer system in 2000 had just become responsible for keeping a dealer brand alive. Manufacturing moved to Dwight. Engineering, service, and offices remained in Peterborough, but the assembly work went north, into the building behind the trees on Highway 60. 2 years later, it happened again. On the 31st of March 2023, Colquhoun Audio Laboratories acquired Magnum Dynalab of Brampton, Ontario, a company known for FM tuners and vacuum tube electronics, built for listeners who still pulled distant stations out of the air. A tuner is the component that receives a broadcast signal and turns it into sound, and Magnum Dynalab had spent decades perfecting the part of that job that mattered to people who lived between transmitters, holding a weak, drifting signal steady. In a country the size of Canada, with CBC repeaters and campus stations scattered across enormous distances, That was not a nostalgia product. It was infrastructure for a certain kind of listener. That manufacturing moved to Dwight as well, with a commitment that the products would continue to be made in Canada. 3 brands, 1 village, 1 loading door. Read one way, it is a consolidation story. Read another way, it is a rescue. Because the pattern underneath both transactions was the same, and it had nothing to do with sales figures. 2 Canadian audio companies reached the end of a generation at roughly the same moment, and the thing that decided their survival was not demand for their products. It was whether somebody with a factory was willing to take them on. The dealer system did not end with an announcement. It ended in pieces. A shop closed. Then another. A chain retired a banner. A demonstration room became retail floor for televisions. Manufacturing left Toronto. Assembly left Peterborough. Assembly left Brampton. Trucks went north. The audition, the act of sitting down and listening before spending money, stopped being how Canadians bought sound. It was not that Canadians stopped buying speakers, they stopped listening to them first. And the company that had removed that room from its own business, back when removing it seemed reckless, turned out to be the one still standing in a factory with the lights on. Axiom Audio is still there. The company continues to design and build loudspeakers in Dwight, Ontario, under Colquhoun Audio Laboratories Limited, and it no longer does so alone. Bryston and Magnum Dynalab are now part of the same operation. 3 Canadian audio names under one roof, with 3 entirely different ideas about how a product should reach a listener. One sells direct. One sells through specialty dealers. One serves an audience that judges a tuner by how well it holds a station fading in from 300 kilometers away. That is not the outcome anyone would have drawn in 1980. The older products have outlived their catalog. M22 bookshelf pairs, M60 towers, and EP series subwoofers turn up regularly on Canuck Audio Mart and Kijiji, and they tend to move quickly. Speakers of that age require maintenance, refoaming, which means replacing the foam surround that allows a woofer's cone to travel and which perishes with time, and recapping, replacing the capacitors in a crossover that drift out of tolerance over decades. Both are ordinary jobs for a competent technician, and a well-built cabinet is worth the work because the enclosure and the engineering inside it do not age the way the parts do. Foam perishes. Solder does not. But the strongest evidence that Axiom's argument was correct is not in a classified listing. It is in the way loudspeakers are sold in this country right now. Consider what a Canadian buyer takes for granted today. Manufacturers publish frequency response measurements as a matter of routine. Brands sell directly from their own websites worldwide with no distributor in between. Return windows are standard, and the audition happens in the buyer's own living room rather than in a showroom. A speaker's reputation is built by independent measurement and published review rather than by whoever happened to be working the floor that afternoon. Every one of those is now ordinary. Every one of them was a strange decision made in a village in Muskokas around the turn of the 2000s, at a moment when the trade considered it close to commercial suicide. That is the legacy, and it is not a sentimental one. Axiom did not preserve the old way of selling audio. It rehearsed the new one, early, in public, and at its own risk. The other legacy is not Axiom's alone. The research program that reshaped the company in Ottawa reshaped the wider industry as well. Anechoic measurement correlated with double-blind listening spread outward through the designers who took part in that work and the literature that followed it, and became the standard vocabulary of loudspeaker engineering far beyond Canada. When a manufacturer anywhere publishes a response curve today and expects a buyer to trust it rather than a demonstration, it is leaning on an argument settled in a federal laboratory in Ottawa in the early 1980s, with a handful of young Canadians sitting in the listening room. The building itself is unchanged in the way that matters. It still sits back from Highway 60, dark brown, screened by trees, easy to miss at highway speed. The anechoic chamber is still inside it, So is the 100-foot base tower, built to measure down to 10 hertz in a village most Canadians only drive through on the way to a lake. And there is a detail in the Bryston story that reframes the entire arrangement. Long before the 2021 sale, Bryston loudspeakers were already being built in Dwight. The Bryston speaker line began as a project involving James Tanner and Axiom's designers, developed with the Muskoka factory and manufactured there. For years, dealers in Canada and abroad sold Bryston speakers to customers who walked in, sat down, listened, and bought them in a demonstration room. Speakers measured in Axiom's chamber and assembled on Axiom's benches. The company that skipped the dealer room had been supplying it the whole time, which is the part of this history most worth keeping. Canadian audio is usually remembered as a story of brands lost, factories closed, names sold abroad, catalogs discontinued. Some of that is accurate. But the thing that actually disappeared from this country was not a list of companies. It was a habit. For roughly 4 decades, buying sound in Canada meant going somewhere and listening. It meant a bench, a comparison panel, a salesperson who knew what a crossover was, and an afternoon spent deciding. That habit built an industry. The demonstration rooms created the demand that supported the factories, and the factories at Daiquiris in Toronto, in Peterborough, in Brampton, in Dwight, employed engineers, cabinet makers, and service technicians in Canadian towns. The habit went first, the rooms followed, the manufacturing followed the rooms. Axiom's founder moved before any of it arrived, and not because he predicted the internet. He moved because he trusted a measurement more than a showroom, which was the same instinct that had taken him to Ottawa in the first place. The belief that sound could be proven rather than argued about. That proof is still being made in the same place. If these Canadian audio histories are worth your time, subscribe. There are more of them than anyone expects, and most have never been documented anywhere. On a January morning in Dwight, a forklift moves a pallet of speaker cartons through a loading door, and the snow along Highway 60 takes the sound of it away.